Hello, my name is André Gagné. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So this is part 2 of a series I started, which is called Unraveling the End Times. I think this is an interesting and very intriguing series. A lot of people have been watching that first clip. If you missed it, just go back and take a few minutes to watch it, because I'm going to continue from where I left off. I'm just going to recap a bit. And there's a lot of things to cover today. I'm going to try to do as much as I can, but we will need more clips on this in the coming days and weeks. So if you remember, I talked about eschatology. I described what it was, the study of the last things. And then we went into the various views that exist, or the frameworks, the interpretative frameworks that are used to read what people understand to be biblical prophecy. So there's the preterist view, which sees everything from a past perspective. When you're reading passages or texts like Matthew 24 or the book of Revelation, this is past. These are events that happened under the Roman Empire for the most part. There's also the partial preterist view that sees part of these things as past, but also predicting future events. We've looked at the historicist view, which understands all of these passages as referring to the past, but the development, for example, in the book of Revelation, the development of the church age throughout time. And so there's a kind of predictive element in the book of Revelation, but someone can look back at the events that unfold in the book of Revelation and try to pair it up with certain events throughout church history. There's also the idealist view, which reads all of this literature as symbolic, as representing the battle between good and evil. And lastly, but not least, and we focused more on that perspective, which is the futuristic perspective, which understand most of these texts as predictive, as referring to things in the past, as referring to things that Jesus predicted or that the book of Revelation predicted for the end times. Then, if you remember, we tackled the millennium, and there are various perspectives on that. This is the 1000 reign of Jesus. We read the passage from the book of Revelation in chapter 20, verses 1 to 8, that talks about a time where Christ will reign for 1,000 years, and there are various ways of understanding this. Some people read it as a symbolic number representing many, many years, but not specifically 1,000 years. Others understand this number as a literal 1,000 years. And you have different perspectives in terms of what we call premillennialism, post-millennialism, and amillennialism. We focused on one aspect of premillennialism. If you remember, we talked about dispensational premillennialism. And I gave a definition of that, so you should go back to that first video for that definition. But in a nutshell, the dispensations is essentially understanding as what you see now on your screen. So essentially dispensationalists, and this is fairly new as an approach to the Bible. It's about 200 years old only, very much popularized by G.N. Darby, the Schofield Bible, and so on. It understands the unfolding of human history into periods of time. So it's all about the periodization of history. And dispensationalists understand history as having been unfolded in 7 dispensations, 7 moments, 7 periods of time where God deals with certain individuals and peoples in a particular way. So on the chart, you see those 7 dispensations. It starts with the dispensation of innocence in Genesis 2 and 3, and how God dealt with humankind at creation. And then from Genesis 4 to Genesis chapter 8, the second dispensation after what is commonly called the fall of humankind, where humankind sinned against God. They were in a period called the conscience, so they were aware of what they were doing. Then there's another dispensation, the third one, which is called the dispensation of the government. And that goes from the period of the flood to the Tower of Babel, from Genesis 9 to Genesis 11, human government. Then there's one called the promise, and this falls under, of course, Abraham, and it goes up to the judges and part of the history of Israel, at least its early history, from Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis chapter 50. And then there's a very, very long dispensation called the law. And this is the time where Israel was, of course, enslaved in Egypt, and was delivered by Moses, and God gave Moses the law, and it goes up till the time of Jesus' death. And after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, a new dispensation began, that dispensation called the dispensation of the church, where God does not deal with Israel temporarily. And this is, of course, understood according to their interpretation of Romans chapter 11. All the previous dispensations, most of them, at least up till the time of the promise, from the time of the promise, dealt with Israel. But now under the dispensation of the church, Israel is temporarily in a state of unbelief towards the Messiah. And this will change at one point. That point will be the period called the Tribulation and the Great Tribulation. We will be talking about this in just a few minutes. So there is that church dispensation up until the time of what they understand to be the rapture. And we talked about this. I read a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 to 18, if you remember. The rapture of the church, and then there's these 7 years of tribulation. Christ returns at the end of the tribulation. And then there's this last dispensation called the millennium, a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, where Christ returns to earth with the raptured church and will reign with the church. Now, if you remember, we talked about the rapture. I read the passage in 1 Thessalonians. There's another interesting text that kind of elaborates what will happen at the rapture. The rapture is a moment where people that are alive at that time, according to dispensationalists and people that believe in this idea, there will be people at the time of the rapture. They will be caught up in the air and they will join Jesus in the air. And those that have died, that had been Christians but had died, will be resurrected and will meet Christ in the air and will be with Jesus in heaven for that period of 7 years while God sends his judgments on the world. And you'll see the apparition of the appearing, I should say, of the Antichrist at that time, the reconstruction of the second temple, and so on. The third temple, the Jewish temple, and so on. But we'll detail all of this as we go along. I just want to read the second passage that is interesting in terms of what the rapture is about. You can see it on your screen. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 50 to 53. It reads as follows. What I am saying, and here it's Paul that is writing to the Corinthians. That chapter is actually dedicated to the resurrection. What I am saying, brothers and sisters, is this. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. So you see, this is how it will happen. People will not go to meet Christ in the air with their normal bodies, but they will have transformed, glorified bodies. So those living on earth will have their bodies transformed immediately, and those that had died, they will have new bodies, transformed, glorified bodies, and will be with Christ in heaven during that 7-year period of tribulation. Now, that's the rapture. The rapture is understood in various ways. It's understood as happening in various moments, depending on which eschatological system you adopt. There are people that believe that the rapture is something that happens before the tribulation, so pre-tribulational rapture. There are people that believe that the rapture will happen in the middle of the tribulation, so right at the point of 3.5 years or 1,260 days, Christians will be raptured. And then there are those that believe in what is called a pre-wrath rapture, which comes at about a three-quarter time period of the entire 7 years. So that's pre-wrath. That means Christians will not have to suffer the wrath of God, which is at the last part of the 7 years of tribulation, the last third, we would say. And then there are those that believe in a post-tribulation rapture. That means that after the 7 years of tribulation, then Christians will be raptured and come back right away with Christ to reign in the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign. Now, this, of course, there's, like I said, these are various perspectives, but in all of these 4 different sequences, this is all called premillennialism. That means in every case, the rapture happens before this 1,000 years, okay? So there are people that don't even believe in a literal 7-year tribulation. They still believe in a kind of a rapture, and that would be a premillennial rapture. This would be not dispensationalism, premillennialists, or premillennialism, but it would be just historic premillennialism, meaning that people don't necessarily believe in different dispensations throughout time, these 7 dispensations that I told you about, but they still believe that Christians will be raptured before a literal millennium. Now, where does this idea of this 7-year tribulation come from? This comes from a very obscure passage that is, of course, interpreted differently depending on if you're a preterist or a partial preterist or a futurist in how you read this text. But it's a very obscure passage from the book of Daniel, which is a Hebrew Bible prophet. So it's a prophet in the Hebrew Bible. In chapter 9, there's a passage, we will read it, and then I will give you the explanation that is provided by those that adopt a dispensationalist premillennial perspective. Okay, those that really understand this as a literal 7 years. Okay, those that adopt dispensationalism. So let's look at this passage. You see it on your screen in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. It reads as follows, and here it's an angel speaking to the prophet Daniel. So Daniel has this revelation. It says this: 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand, from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, and in a troubled time. After 62 weeks, an anointed shall be cut off, and shall have nothing, And the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates, until the decreed end is poured on upon the desolator. Very long passage, but obscure passage also. So I had to read it so that you could see where this idea of a 7-year tribulation in a dispensational model comes from. Essentially here, the writer of Daniel is relating some kind of vision that the prophet is having, and he's talking about 70 weeks that have been decreed on your people. So on the people of Israel and on the city of Jerusalem. 70 weeks are in fact 70 weeks of years. So in fact, we need to understand each week as corresponding to a set of years. So 1 week corresponds to 7 years. So one of the ways that dispensationalists break this down, they actually attribute certain events to the portions of weeks that are described in this 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. So if you look at your screen right now, you will see this chart that actually breaks down Daniel's 70 weeks. So you see, there are decreed 70 weeks in all, and the purpose, of course, is to bring about a certain amount of things, so that transgression will be finished, that sin will end, to atone for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to anoint a most holy place, to seal the vision, all of these things. Now, if you look at each of these elements, you will see that these correspond to specific events. So Daniel's we'll be talking about 70 weeks, but they are actually broken down into 3 moments. There's, first of all, you see on the left of the chart, there are 7 weeks of years, which corresponds to 49 years. And then there are 62 weeks of years, which correspond to 434 years, for a total of 483 years, which corresponds to Daniel's 69 weeks. This is what you find in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Now, Daniel is going to say that there are 7 weeks that are dedicated for the rebuilding of Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince. This corresponds to the date of the edict of Artaxerxes to Ezra to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, this corresponds to 7 weeks of years, 49 years. Okay, so they calculate 49 years. So it started in 4:9, according to this chart, or according to how dispensationalists understand this, give and take from 457. Okay, before Common Era. After the rebuilding of the city, the temple, all of this, there's going to be a period of time that will lead Israel up to the moment of the Messiah. This period of time corresponds to 62 weeks of years, so 434 years. So these 69 years go from 457 before Common Era to 27 Common Era. So the date of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, approximately, give and take a few years, to the point where we have his crucifixion. So 79 years, according to dispensationalists, have already been accomplished towards Israel. And these were comprised with events that took place in the rebuilding of Jerusalem as a city and the period leading to the Messiah. But then there's a big gap. There's still 1 week missing, 1 week of years that is missing. That 1 week of years has to be accomplished because that 1 week of years, according to the passage that we read in chapter 9, that 1 week of years actually is reserved for Israel. All of these 70 years are for the people of Israel. They have nothing to do with the church. Okay? So there is essentially in the time frame for dispensationalists, there is a kind of prophetic gap that doesn't deal with any of the 70 weeks. And that prophetic gap is this period of time that is called the church age. Since the time of Christ's ascension into heaven until the time of its rapture, okay, of the rapture of the church, that is the period of the church age. And then there is that 1 week of years which corresponds to 7 years. You see? So that is the 7-year tribulation that dispensationalists understand. This 7 year of tribulation that is divided into 2 sections, or half a week each, which would correspond to 3.5 years, or sometimes you'll come across the number 1,260 days. That corresponds to 3.5 years, according to the biblical type of calendar. Okay? So that moment, that 7th year, or that last week, you'll find it in Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 to 27. We read about that. Now, in the middle of that year, or that week, the sacrifice will be ceased in the temple. So the temple needs to be rebuilt. You see, in the logic of dispensationalism, the temple will be rebuilt. The 3rd temple of the Jews, a 3rd temple, will be rebuilt for the tribulation period. And the Jews will start again offering sacrifices in the temple up to the middle of the tribulation period, where there will be a desolation, where there will be an abomination, where it is believed that the Antichrist will cut or will discontinue the covenant that he had established. So Daniel chapter 9 talks about the one who makes a covenant for 1 week. For dispensationalists, this is the Antichrist. We will come back to this figure in subsequent videos, but this he corresponds to the final end days Antichrist. The Antichrist that you have in the Left Behind series, for example, LaHaye and Jenkins Left Behind series. So that Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel for 7 years. In the middle of the covenant, he will break that covenant. So he will give them the authority to rebuild their temple at the beginning of the tribulation. They will reinstate the sacrifices and everything that was normal in the previous temples, the worship and the rituals that will be reestablished. But in the middle of the tribulation, he will have this cease. He will break his covenant, and he will actually, for dispensationalists, he will create an abomination of desolation in the temple. He will probably put an image of himself and have himself be worshipped as God. So they read certain passages in 1 Thessalonians that talk about that, 2 Thessalonians, in Matthew 24, when it talks about the abomination of desolation. They understand this as that moment in the middle of the tribulation period. Okay, so but this is all futuristic. You see, all of this reading of Daniel chapter 9 is futuristic, and there's still this 1 week left that needs to be accomplished in the 70 weeks of Daniel, and that's the tribulation period. Now, this is a futuristic reading, you see, so preterists don't understand this. They in the same way. For them, it all has been accomplished already. These 70 weeks of Daniel, they all correspond to past events. And when we'll talk about post-millennialism, I'll talk about what this means for them. But it's all past, okay? The one that makes the sacrifice cease in Daniel, at the end of Daniel chapter 9, it's actually Jesus through his death. So there won't be any more sacrifices needed in the temple because Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. But for dispensationalists, it has nothing to do with Jesus. It has to do with the Antichrist at the end times, the 7-year tribulation period, okay? So this is very important to understand because there are various Christians today that have various types of eschatological frameworks, and it's easy to get all of this mixed up. Very, very easy, because all of them sometimes often talk about the rapture, sometimes use another term for the rapture. They will be talking about translation or a change. Sometimes they'll be talking about the rapture before the millennium, after the millennium. They'll be talking about things like tribulation saints. Who are they? So we need to make sure that we understand each of the frameworks that these people have. And of course, the frameworks that they have will play on the worldview and will determine often the type of political agenda that they have. Now, if you remember in my last video, I talked about Eberle and Trench's book, which is a very important book. It's actually a good book on eschatology, and you should read it if you haven't. It's called Victorious Eschatology, and it's an important book. And it really lays out some of these differences. As I was mentioning, Eberle and Trench, they adopt a partial preterist framework of interpretation. They are not dispensationalists, okay? But they adopt a partial preterist. That means that some of the passages that they read, for example, in Matthew 24 and in the book of Revelation, are already past. And they are to be applied to events at the time of the writing. But at the same time, they do still believe that portions of these texts are for the future or for the end times and still need to be accomplished. Now, one interesting feature about this book, this Victorious Eschatology book by Eberle and Trench, is that they do have, as co-authors, different perspectives on the millennium. Now, for Trench is what we call a post-millennial. He adopts a perspective that the millennium, like I was saying, started with the ascension of Christ, as Christ is now seated at the right hand of God, and he's reigning through the church, and progressively the church is bringing about in the world the kingdom of God and preparing for the second coming. So we are in this millennial reign. Okay, so it's more of the 1,000 years is not literal, but it's many, many years. Whereas, and of course, when we talk in terms of the rapture, where Jesus comes back and will reign after that, all of that is post-millennial. Whereas Trench is premillennial. He's still a partial preterist, meaning that things written in the Bible were past, but some are future. But he still believes in a literal millennium. So he believes that Christ will come back, and then, of course, rapture the church at the same time. All of this will happen. It's going to be one event. And then there's going to be a literal millennium. So we are not for Eberle in the millennium. The millennium is to come. As for Trench, we are in the millennium. Okay? So it's different. So Eberle believes that Christians will go through times of tribulation. He doesn't believe necessarily in a literal antichrist figure. They explain this differently. When I come to explain postmillennialism, I'll explain at the same time what the antichrist means for them as a partial preterist kind of view. Okay, we'll come back to the antichrist at one point. What's important when you read other people like LaHaye and Jenkins, their entire 16-book series, this is dispensational premillennialism. So LaHaye is a dispensationalist. So LaHaye literally believes in 7 years tribulation. This is what it means. His books on tribulation force and all of that. All of that refers to the tribulation. The fourth book, which is called Left Behind, it's because people have been left behind. So the three prequels that were written later on, because he started with the Left Behind, and then he did 3 prequels, where you have one it's called The Rising, then The Regime, and then The Rapture. These 3 prequels are before the tribulation period, before people have been left behind. Okay, so in the first 3, you have the Antichrist that is born, and you know the government system that's starting to be put in place and things like that. And then there's the rapture in the 3rd book. But then the 4th book is the Left Behind. So everything that follows after that, Christians have been raptured. Now, there are Christians in the other books, but the Christians in the other books are tribulation saints, which are which are completely different than the raptured saints that happen at the beginning of the tribulation. So LaHaye and Jenkins are pre-tribulation rapture believers. So they believe that the rapture will be before the tribulation. They're not mid-tribulation, pre-wrath, or post-tribulation. They're pre-tribulation. And if there are Christians throughout the tribulation period, these Christians will be converted through different means during the tribulation period. Okay? And Christ will come back at the end. So you have one of the last books, the second to last book is called The Glorious Appearing, which Jesus comes back. And then you have the kingdom, which is the millennial kingdom. Okay? But all of the books in between that, in between the 3rd book and the last book, or the second to last book, all of this information that is given is during the tribulation, and Christians have already been raptured. So we need to be very, very conscious of that, so that we don't kind of mix up these various eschatological systems. Now, I tweeted recently about Mike Bickle's perspective on the millennium and the rapture and all of this. So Mike Bickle has a different perspective than that of LaHaye and Jenkins, in the sense that he believes in a rapture, but he believes in a post-tribulation rapture. Okay? Still believes in a literal millennium, still believes in a 7-year tribulation, still a dispensationalist in that sense of a 7-year tribulation. But I'm not very convinced of the fact that he's a dispensationalist, a full dispensationalist. I know that it's clear for him that there's a 7-year tribulation. That's clear. And that there's a literal antichrist, and there's going to be the reconstruction of the temple. All of this is clear for Bickle and IHOP, okay? The people that teach there. This is clear. But the rapture is at the end of the tribulation, and the saints throughout the tribulation, that means all the Christians, they will be a victorious group of people. Okay, they will be victorious Christians. They will, through their prayer, through their spiritual warfare, enact the judgments of God on earth. So all of the various judgments that are presented in the book of Revelation, the church will be instrumental in bringing about those judgment. Bickle thinks that it's going to be the church's most glorious moment, the tribulation. It will be very difficult because there's going to be a mass apostasy, and people are going to fall away, but at the same time there's going to be a tremendous power given to these Christians as they are living through the tribulation period, through the Antichrist and all of that. Okay? And some of them will be martyred through that. So the difference between, when you think about it, because it could be very similar to Eberle's perspective that sees the rapture prior to the millennium. It could be very similar, but at the same time it's different because Eberle is a partial preterist. So some of the passages are past, some are futuristic, whereas Bickle reads everything that is prophetic as future. Okay, for Bickle, Matthew 24 has nothing to do with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era. It has nothing to do with events in the time of Jesus' day. Everything is related to the tribulation period, okay, and science prior to that. Okay, but really, everything is related to the end times. And the book of Revelation, it's the same thing. Okay, whereas Eberle will see a combination of past and future elements in it. So it's very different. But at the same time, this kind of eschatology is very, very malleable in the sense that there's no problem for someone like Mike Bickle to adopt ideas such as Joel's army or the manifested sons of God, because they will be endowed with supernatural abilities, because it's going to be the church's most glorious moment, this tribulation period. Do you understand what I'm saying? So they're still premillennialists. They're not post-millennial. Bickle is not post-millennial. He is premillennial. He reads things very literally. The only difference is that he places the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation, which is literal, prior to a literal millennium, and the rapture prior to that millennial reign. And of course, we will unpack this at one point, but it corresponds to what you see on the screen right now. What he endorses is essentially historic premillennialism. And if you look at his stuff, he's going to say that they are essentially historic premillennialists at IHOP. They're not really dispensationalists. Even if even if Daniel chapter 9 is understood, like that's last week is understood as being really literal, and it refers to the tribulation period, they are historic premillennialists in the sense that there is a tribulation, the church will go through that tribulation, the rapture will happen at the end. It's part of the second coming. In fact, what is called the second coming will be in stages. It's going to be a process or a procession where Jesus is going to come across the sky, where everyone will see him and gather his elect. So there's going to be the rapture and the resurrection of the Christians at that moment. And then the second moment will be he will come to Edom, or modern day Jordan. And then the third moment will be he will arrive in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives and establish his millennial kingdom and destroy the Antichrist and the false prophet. But you see, Bickle, for him, that's the sequence of events. And it's all a futuristic reading. Okay? So we've covered a lot of ground, I think, again today. I want to thank you for listening and watching all of these videos. If you find what I do useful, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's completely free. You can share, like, and of course you can comment. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again very shortly with another video that will be dedicated to the end times. So thank you once again, and have a great week.